Lovely to talk to you today. Before I launch into Julian Huxley, let me just stick with Marcus for the moment. Many of you here, not all of you I understand, have just spent a very fascinating afternoon with colleagues talking about assisted reproductive technologies and to putting assisted reproductive technologies and demography together. I think that it may be that when it comes to the 20th and 21st of June, mark that down, when we have our Mothers Conference, we do have a session where Sarah Franklin will be speaking. We have colleagues from India and China talking about new fertilities, changing fertilities in other parts of the world, and I would very much hope that the conversations that we've had today may actually flow on. So there is more population and reproduction to come. But I did decide today to talk, rather oddly in some ways, about Julian Huxley, but it seems to me that once whenever you ask a historian to speak, they are of course going to talk about the past. Perhaps happily for you, I do quite a lot of my history in the not too distant past, and I'm especially interested in the generation that Julian Huxley lived through, the several generations where people caught the First World War and the Second World War, and Huxley died in 1975, right up close to, of course, some of our lifetimes here, but he died right up against the point at which assisted reproductive technologies were commercializing and really taking off. So his was a very 20th century life. But I'm going to, in particular, talk about the early 1960s, because it was in 1961 that the famous Gregory Pincus had an idea, or really another idea. Of course, in 1961, already Pincus's pill was taking off, and he thought it was time to take stock of the large change that seemed imminent. And he wanted to gather with others whose applied researchers already seemed to be shifting things into a different kind of future. So Pincus said the world was unprepared socially, politically, and ethically for the advent of nuclear power. Now biological research is in ferment, he said, creating and promising methods of interference with natural processes which we could destroy or could transform, nearly every aspect of human life which we value. And it's interesting to me, and I'll come back to this, that Pincus himself, perhaps unsurprisingly, put natural processes in his own sentence in inverted commas. And in a way, it's inside those inverted commas that many of the people I'm going to talk to, not least Julian Huxley, and perhaps many of the people who are in discussions today, live their intellectual lives. So Pincus had this idea. He wanted to bring minds together. The outcome was a conference, and it was called Man and His Future, and it was held in Portland Place in 1963. Pincus himself spoke on the control of reproduction in mammals. Colin Clark spoke on agricultural productivity. Don McKay on humans and machines. A.S. Parks on sex ratios in humans. Joshua Lederberg was there. He spoke on biological futures. Herman Muller, and I'll have more to say about him, was the one who spoke most on assisted reproductive technologies, which we've been talking about today. Alex Comfort, really intriguingly, was also there, and Comfort spoke on the longevity of human tissues, and there were many more experts. All of these papers and more were commented upon by Paul Crick. So this was clearly a meeting in 1963 of major stellar minds, and they were gathering in what they all knew already was a key moment in reproductive biology, but they didn't quite know in what way. Many of them, like Pincus in particular, were in their prime. But the meeting was bookended by two of the elder statesmen of biology, both of whom brought, and this is what interests me in particular, vast timescales to the discussion. J.B.S. Haldane closed the conference, and he closed this conference on the biological future of man with a paper on his projections for the human species over the next 10,000 years. And it was Julian Huxley, of course, who opened the proceedings with a paper that he called The Future of Man, Evolutionary Aspects. So as you know, it's mainly Huxley, mainly the wonderful Julian Huxley, on whom I focus in this lecture, and I do so completely expediently because now that I've just finished a book on Malthus, and it's the Huxleys that I now want to focus on quite closely. So I have another project just beginning in which I want to bring this extraordinary several generations together. T.H. Huxley, of course, the grandfather, and his two famous grandsons, Julian and Aldous Huxley. I want to bring them together into one frame as a way of analysing imperial 19th century and international 20th century biological sciences. And of course, for that particular family, and this is what really interests me, biology, molecular biology, genetics, all of these things for the Huxley family were always deeply political matters. They were never not. And this included always political biologies of reproduction. So in this lecture, I look into how reproductive futures were imagined from a particular point in the past, from 1963, which happens to be the year I just realised in which I was born. So let's call it, indulge me, let's call it a good year, 1963, how reproductive futures were imagined in that particular era. Right on the cusp, 1963, as we know, of really major change. Everybody at that meeting sensed it was a turning point as well, perhaps in the same way as everybody at our meeting this afternoon sensed that something is going on, something is shifting where we need to take stock of assisted reproductive technologies. And so, to borrow Marcia Inghorn's term, my question is, what was 1963's future bioscape? Well, I'm a historian, like a few others here, a few of my colleagues. I'm always interested in how the business of temporality links the work of those of us who work on one hand in reproductive sciences, broadly conceived, and those of us who work in history. I always think that generation and generations link us, I mean, almost methodologically, certainly conceptually. But it's also the case that different generations, of course, conceptualize reproductive futures in entirely different scales. So currently, at the moment, it seems to me that reproduction, including assisted reproductive technologies, tends to be considered perhaps as a two-generation enterprise, one-generation enterprise, the parent and the newborn. However wide that generation is becoming, as we've just learned. That kind of one or two generations space and time span did consider some in the 1963 group, but when they thought about one generation, they were as likely, I think, to look backwards to the wartime generation, to think about what had happened between the wartime and their own. That was the one generation back that they were most interested in, I think, unsurprisingly. But when they looked forward, they didn't think about one or two generations. They didn't really think at a generational scale at all. So characteristically, they looked forward at an evolutionary scale. And it's that interests me. That came quite naturally to them, and it seems quite unfamiliar to us now. They could leap forward and imagine reproductive futures 10,000 years hence in a single bound. And they delighted in doing so. They specialised in it. They were a generation, I think, of really interesting reproductive futurologists of a sort. But in this lecture, I suggest that they, in doing so, they failed to see what was to unfold just ahead of their own time. It didn't really need a leap at all. First, they failed to perceive the kind of commercialized bioeconomy that their own work had released, and that was in fact already facilitating. And second, in 1963, they seemed unable to discern a really highly individualized and gendered reproductive constituency that was already picking up the technology that they had unleashed. So their talk was all of species fulfillment, which was really interesting, and population-level dangers or possibilities. In seeking to understand what they called the biological future of man, 1963, quite patently, and although this is an obvious thing to say, it's nonetheless true, in seeking to understand the biological future of man, they were not paying enough attention to the biological future of women. So let me begin with a little background on Julian Huxley, who will be familiar to many of you, perhaps not all. Of all the extraordinary biologists, geneticists, mathematicians, endocrinologists present at this meeting on the biological future of man, why was Huxley the opener in 1963? And why do I want to write a book about him and his family? He was, of course, grandson of T.H. Huxley, elder brother of Aldous. He was educated just before the First World War in Oxford in zoology, specialising really in avian ethology, and he took an early position in 1913, if I remember correctly, at Rice University in Texas. After the war, he was professor of zoology at KCL. But really from the beginning, he was attracted to the possibilities of communication, of science writing, broadcasting, of the communication of this moment where clearly post-Darwin, post-Mendel, all kinds of ideas needed to be publicised. And in fact, as many of you will know, he famously resigned his KCL professorship in order to write the book, The Science of Life, with H.G. Wells. So it's really one of the most extraordinary abandonment of a very promising academic career. H.G. Wells promised him many thousands of pounds in royalties were they to hole up together in a cottage in Cornwall somewhere, I think it was, also with Wells's son. And H.G. Wells managed to persuade Julian Huxley, who was a star on the rise, to abandon being an academic and a zoologist, and to follow Huxley into the world of writing and communication. And that began a life of science writing and broadcasting and synthesizing scholarship in evolutionary biology and in early ecology, both of which, of course, centered around the relationship between fertility and mortality, mainly infant mortality. So early in Huxley's career, reproduction, generations, and indeed time became a complex that really intrigued him. He began with experimental embryology, including experiments on hormonal control of metamorphosis in a number of different organisms. He fed larval axolotls on the thyroid gland of the ox, and he claimed that he had recreated an animal that had not existed, he said, except in tadpole form for many thousands of years. He also spent some time early in his career working on longevity in tissues, mainly on tapeworms, but he was already thinking about the translation of these ideas, these experiments to human organisms. And he connected this work on tapeworm tissues in the 1920s to clinical work on the rejuvenation of human tissues and of humans themselves. Peculiar reproduction, as well as aging, engaged Huxley early on. He was experimentally versed in ontogeny, the history of an organism in its own lifetime, and in the evolutionary history of a species. And it seems to me that in a way tracking his research career may be about tracking time and tissues and species from one scale to the other. The idea of extension and enhancement of life within and over generations tracked from a very exciting 1920s moment through his invention of the term transhumanism. It was Huxley who gave us the term transhumanism in the 1950s, right through until the cryopreservation of life extension he sought before his own death in 1975. So possibilities of tissues, possibilities of organisms, transhuman leaps was something that he imagined, and it must be said, experimented with on certain kinds of organisms. But Huxley was really a philosopher of nature as well, perhaps a cosmologist of sorts. In 1963, he asked his very distinguished colleagues to think about nature. Of course, everybody was, but not to imagine nature as fixed. He said, we have to proceed on the understanding that there's no dualistic split between soul and body, between matter and mind, between life and not life, no cleavage between natural and supernatural, and there we can hear H.G. Wells. All phenomena, he said, from worms to women, from radiation to religion, are natural. So Huxley, really for his whole life, had been operating, as it were, in the space of Gregory Pincus's inverted commas around what qualifies nature. Human enhancement, improvement, change, in reproduction, as in all kinds of other matters, drove Julian Huxley forward very strongly in his communication of scientific fact, as strongly as it drove his famous brother, Aldous, in scientific fiction. And one of the reasons why I'm so interested in drawing these Huxleys over very curious generations together is that it seems, to me, in kind of an unusual way, all three of them asked the same large questions about nature, about science, about religion, about scales of time into the deep past and the distant future. But the three of them did so, Huxley, the grandfather, and the two grandsons did so in completely different worlds. In a world high in curial science in the mid-19th century, when Darwin is just emerging, and for the two grandsons, really their high points from the 30s through to the 60s, in the middle of an international 20th century moment. So it's that intrigues me about them. So Huxley was a key part of a 20th century generation who thought about reproductive possibilities, actually ecologically. That is, within the particular systems of thought that was driving ecology early in the 1920s. They also thought about reproductive possibilities always genetically, socially, politically, and demographically. Embryology, Huxley said, embryology, reproduction, and genetics reveal all sorts of extremely exciting facts, and really his life, I think, was about communicating those changes. He was able, like so many in his generation, to slip conceptually and experimentally between organisms quite readily, from tapeworms to humans. And I should say here that although I recognise the kind of automatic controversy that flows around this generation, contrary to most critical scholars of 20th century biology, this shift between organisms, between any given organism and humans, is something that I actually see as that generation's great intellectual virtues, while also obviously able to perceive its critical effects. But really my point is that that generation themselves did as well. This was a generation of highly politicized, mainly leftist groups, for whom the observation that there were difficulties and political effects about, making connections between tapeworms and humans would have been altogether obvious, and in fact they spent rather more of their lives, probably than I, in thinking through the implications of that. So that is something that I don't waste too much breath problematizing. Rather, I think it's much more profitable to almost read them at their word and pursue those ideas in that manner. So like many of his generation, Huxley was on the left, he was fully exercised by and conversant with biology's politics. Huxley was one of the foremost critics of racism, operating in the British public sphere, at least in that period. By 1963 then, when they all gathered together, Huxley was the international spokesman of choice about world population growth. The international spokesman of choice for population control, for family planning, that was at its height right at that moment. And of course, the history of fertility and infertility research is completely entwined over the 20th century. So recall, of course, that Pincus's great breakthrough came when he was able to reproduce in vitro fertilization in rabbits in 1934. So both at an applied level and at a research level, the 20th century history of fertility and infertility research is, in a way, one game, if I can call it that. Huxley, all along, was involved in infertility research as well, and others would be interested in him in this respect quite personally. One gentleman wrote to him in a very businesslike way in 1937, writing, "Dear Sir, dear Huxley, would you consent to being the father of my wife's child, possibly by artificial insemination?" He said, "I'm writing this as a feeler and purely from the eugenic point of view." Now, this kind of inquiry, although very boldly personal, I like to think would hardly have startled Huxley as someone interested and well-versed, of course, in the physiology of reproduction and in then relatively new assisted reproduction. Julian Huxley, we don't know, or at least I don't know yet, Julian Huxley might well have agreed to this request, but equally as someone interested in genetics and inheritance and in eugenics, he may well have declined, only too cognizant of the depressive illness that tragically ran right through his family. So let me just talk about Huxley's, the kind of vocabulary, the terms of the future that Huxley used. Changing conceptions of time ran all the way through his work. But if T.H. Huxley's mid-19th century world was one in which the scale of the past was quickly changing in the mid-19th century, it was dramatically receding into geological time from biblical time in T.H. Huxley's world, the grandfather. For the grandson, Julian Huxley, in his mid-20th century world, was rather more about the future, strongly in an evolutionary frame, viewed from the horizon of high modernity. So for T.H. Huxley, there was this receding past. For Julian Huxley, there was this long, distant evolutionary future that he was always interested in. So at the Man and His Future meeting, 1963, Huxley spruiked a philosophy which he called evolutionary humanism. Humankind, he thought, was in a very special place in 1963, a special moment in time that just happened to coincide with his own lifetime. The mechanism of evolution had been brought into conscious thought. He said, we're now on the threshold of a truly critical step into the phase of self-conscious evolution. So evolution had entered a completely different domain of possibility. And it was actually Alex Comfort who, when they were all discussing this evolutionary humanism in 1963, Alex Comfort kept on returning to it, and he said, so Julian Huxley has given us reasons for doubting whether pure first-order effects of selection pressures can ever again be separated from the mass of second-order and social effects on human biology. Sarah Franklin said something not dissimilar an hour or two ago, it seems to me. But what was the language? What was Huxley's language of the future? Of evolutionary humanism. The really distinctive term that circled all the way through this conference in 1963, placed there by Huxley, was fulfillment. It's a strangely psychological term. Given humankind mankind's new knowledge of the process and mechanism of evolution, Huxley claimed that the human future would not be defined, he said, by a struggle for existence, but by a striving for what he called again and again fulfillment. And it was something between an instinctive drive and a self-directed or actively self-implemented improvement. He said greater fulfillment for more individuals and fuller achievement by more societies through greater realization of human possibilities and fuller enjoyment of human capacities. And although at several points he pitched his idea of fulfillment against the idea of struggle, in some ways I think it more correctly perhaps substituted for the idea of improvement, although you can go by the way, I'm not entirely sure about this, but I think it perhaps substituted for improvement, and improvement by the 1960s I think was a dreadfully old-fashioned term. Greater fulfillment, Huxley said, can only come about by the realization of more of our potentialities. Once people grasp what a small fraction of humanity's potentialities are actually being realized and what vast new possibilities are waiting to be elicited, we shall have a new and powerful motive to activate our future. And he talked about this as a kind of fulfillment, a new fulfillment economy. Very occasionally, Huxley wrote about fulfillment as a kind of an interior state of being, a psychological aspiration, a drive to complete, to realize individual potential. But I think what's perhaps interesting to us, given the conversation many of us have just had about assisted reproductive technologies, is that even in a context about the future of man, and therefore, of course, about reproduction, for him, for them, fulfillment bore no relation whatsoever to individual desire for or satisfaction from childbirth, parenting, newborns, everything that drives the cultural economy of what's being discussed this afternoon. That version of fulfillment was completely absent in 1963. This is really peculiar, I think, not just in terms of the central place of desire for parenthood in assisted reproduction now, the desire that surely fulfills the commercial, that lies there, it's latently waiting to be picked up for the fulfillment of commercial possibilities, amongst many other things. So it's curious that it wasn't there, not just because it drives so much in reproduction now, but also, I think, in its own context, in the 1960s context of the psychologies of reproduction, is a curious omission. Because, as many of us here know, this was right when the whole idea of motivation, all of those social science studies on motivation that was around contraception, were very much on the agenda. By 1963, what women thought and felt about pregnancy and childbirth was well and truly a whole kind of agendas in the adjacent field of contraceptive research. So oddly, in this context, the term fulfillment emerged again. Motivation to prevent conception was understood to be driven by the need to fulfill some other kind of desire, some other lack, economic, familial, intellectual, and many others. And of course, in this context, 1963 was not any old year. It was the year in which women all over the world were starting to take Pincus's pills to fulfill their other-than-biological destinies. And as it turned out, we now know, they did not know this, our demographic colleagues are now able to tell us that 1963 was also the year in which world population growth peaked. So it's a very interesting moment to think about the future. Huxley and others considering the biological future of man were failing to see the immediate future of contraception and assisted reproductive technologies on the cusp of a new demographic world. They were overlooking the biological future of individual women because they were enthralled to the biological future of man, the species. Well, when I was thinking about what else happened in 1963, I suddenly thought of Betty Friedan. Betty Friedan actually did not make the same mistake. In 1963, just when Huxley was talking about reproductive fulfillment and destiny of the species, Friedan was also pinning down a new vision of destiny, as she put it, that included consideration of Huxley's term fulfillment. She also used this term. We need to remember that the feminine mystique was in part a demographic study. So in a way, the starting point of that extraordinary book, published in 1963, was a series of statements about the demographic context. The average age of marriage, she claimed, in the US was declining, contrary to everything we've been just discussing today, and she claimed that birth rates were rising in the US. And that's the context in which the psychologically trained Friedan actually went on to unfold her thesis. And of course, her point was that this demographic situation was in inverse relationship to happiness. Of course, the late modern history of reproductive fulfillment was set to switch again to an economy of desire for newborns for assisted reproduction, precisely because of Pincus's pills. Huxley, charged with deep thought on the biological future of man, and indeed steeped in fictional reproductive futurology, not least emanating from his own family and his closest friends, really missed both of these terms, contraception and the significance of assisted reproductive technology. Fulfillment for Huxley was about something grander, something more difficult. And yet, individualized motivation, another term from the time, for a kind of selective reproduction did enter his framework for the future. But it answered a quite different problem altogether. So, following a kind of a method for thinking about Huxley's vocabulary, fulfillment and that strange idea emerged over and over again, but so did a more difficult one, and that was Huxley's continual reference to the term quality. He really was enamoured of this term, and it was framed for him by a quite horrifying question that he repeated over and over for many years towards the end of his life. Over and over again, he would write things, call his sections, scribble in his notes that are all now in Rice University, Texas. What are humans for? Whatever the answer, he said, whether to achieve greater efficiency or power, or, as I am suggesting, to find greater fulfillment, he said, it is clear that the general quality of the world's population is not very high, is beginning to deteriorate, and should and could be improved. Now, when talking about species fulfillment, Huxley did mean genetic improvement at a population level, and he was not in the least tiptoeing around the term eugenics. That term was used quite easily, fairly readily in the 1960s, contrary to the claims of many historians who imagine it as having gone underground. And this is an argument that I put forward in the book that I wrote, Global Population. In fact, eugenics was quite discussable, sayable, and the likes of Huxley did so, right through, without even imagining, actually, that it was going to be controversial. That's the interesting thing. So he doesn't imagine a controversy around the term at all through the 1960s. And this is because for Huxley, whether or not we agree, for Huxley, eugenics was not necessarily about race at all. Nor, for him, was it necessarily connected to the Holocaust. And this is why, as one of the era's more prominent anti-racists, Huxley could still deploy it entirely freely and usefully as he saw it. Next for him was species improvement over time, achieved through interventions in reproduction mainly to diminish mental and physical ill health and disability. It's in this context that Huxley saw a mechanism for the biological future of man in assisted reproductive technologies. artificial inseminations by preferred donors of what he would call high genetic quality. In 1963, he noted how established assisted reproductive technologies already were. He said, but it's time for it all to step up a gear. He said, such a policy will not be easy to execute. However, I confidently look forward to a time when eugenic improvement will become one of the major aims of mankind. Now, I'm completely aware that putting eugenics and assisted reproductive technologies always needs a kind of a comment, and those who know my work on eugenics in particular will know that I never pursue the history with a kind of a expose model in mind at all. The eugenic history of assisted reproductive technologies is inconvenient, I fully understand, just as the eugenic history of environmentalism is inconvenient, but at the end of the day, both are matters of fact, not interpretation. And in many ways, I would like to think that my work as a whole de-exceptionalizes. It's difficult in some way, but de-exceptionalizes actually the history of eugenics. Well, assisted reproductive technologies were raised most directly at this 1963 meeting, which I like to think of as a kind of a version, as it were, of the meeting that we've just had to think about the future. It was raised mainly by Hermann Muller, a geneticist, of course, who worked on artificial mutations and X-rays, the Nobel Prize winner for that. He was Huxley's contemporary, almost exactly, and early in their careers they were colleagues at Rice University in Texas, building a biology program. Muller had been actively researching biological futures in humans and other organisms since that time, and with Haldane, Muller and Huxley formed a highly politicized leftist political trio, authors of the 1939 Geneticists Manifesto. And here they were, down in 1963, gathered together to talk about the future, after hydrogen bombs, after nuclear energy, in the middle of the Cold War, the year the pill was released. For Muller, however, the term was not fulfillment, it was betterment. He pushed forward a strange thing called human betterment. At a population level, quality would be enhanced by new techniques of human reproduction, he wrote, quote, such as oral contraception and multiple insemination by deep frozen sperm from desired donors. So in 1963, this was for Muller actually already unremarkable. And so today we talked, today's discussion was partly opened by comments about how routine assisted reproductive technologies has become. And I think it is important to recognise that already in 1963, Muller was presenting this to these fine minds already as a fairly routine set of practices. At least artificial insemination with semen received from a donor was. It was increasingly accepted, he said, at least in the US. And he estimated in 1963 that up to 10,000 births a year, American births a year, were as a result of artificial insemination by donor. But then he said this is old technological capacity. And then he said it's being wasted. Quote, it was long ago found that human semen will recover from freezing, even from deep freezing, and that in the latter state it can probably be preserved indefinitely. He said such preservation will allow the accumulation of larger, more diverse stores, their better appraisal, and the fading away of some of the personal biases and entanglements that might be associated with the donors. And in 1963, although he was saying we've known this for a very long time, we've been practicing this for a very long time, he was trying to add another element to assisted reproductive technologies, what he and others called, as many of you will know, germinal choice. Germinal choice followed standard insemination, except, he said, that, quote, the germinal material here is to be chosen and applied primarily with a view to its eugenic potentialities. Preferably, he said, it should be selected from among banks of germ cells that have been subjected to long-term preservation. Now, critically, of course, for Muller, germinal choice was not necessarily about infertility at all. For germinal choice, for him, efficacy depended as much on control of conception, it's important to realise, as artificial insemination. Both Huxley and Muller tied contraception and assisted reproductive technologies together very tightly indeed. The chances of success of germinal choice, they said, were improved the more reliable and foolproof the means preventing conception are. So for Muller then, the success of germinal choice built from the already widely accepted practice of artificial insemination by donor. An increasing number of couples applied for artificial insemination, he claimed, in cases where the husband carried a strong chance of some grave genetic defect, as he called it. Moreover, a few practitioners are already making it a point to utilise, where feasible, germinal material from donors of outstanding ability and vigour, persons whose genuine merits have been indicated in the trials of life. So effective for him, effective, systematic, widespread germinal choice of donor was the next step. It's entirely characteristic of this generation, unsurprisingly, that none of these choices, or that these were to be choices, nothing was to be imposed, that this would be fully voluntary and democratic. He and Huxley also thought people would make the right choices, which is interesting given our conversation today. And this, oddly, is where Huxley was quite interested, became quite interested in the interior world, and just touched on the idea of fulfillment as a kind of psychological fulfillment. Huxley said in this context, given access to germinal choice, Huxley said, practically all peoples venerate creativity, wisdom, brotherliness, loving kindness, perceptivity, expressivity, joy of life. That may have maybe where Alex Comfort got his title from. Fortitude, vigour, longevity. Huxley said, if presented with the opportunity to have their children approach nearer to such goals than they could do themselves, they will not turn down this golden chance. Even here, though, when they just broached individual motivation, they still misread the immediate future of man. In the context of germinal choice, Huxley was looking for a new model of parenting. He said, we must rid ourselves of preconceptions based on our traditional behaviour in matters of parentage. But in saying that, he was surely failing to register the draw of traditional parenting, as it were, that came to drive assisted reproductive technologies in the decade or so to come. But I just want to say a few words before I close about the context of population growth and world population here. Needless to say, the new oral contraceptive in 1963 was really deeply woven into discussion on assisted reproductive technologies broadly, or germinal choice specifically. And so both Muller and Huxley listened very carefully in 1963 to Pincus as he set out his summary of control of reproduction in mammals, the 1956 to 61 studies of what became the pill. For Pincus's part, however, the key context for all of this was not the usefulness of contraception for the efficacy of germinal choice at all, but was a means to slow world population growth. The effect of the pill on sex ratios was also discussed, interestingly, and demographic projections was very much part of a changing future for them. At various points, this group asked questions, asked the kind of questions to which we now know the answers, which is always intriguing. Joshua Lederberg, for example, wondered if people were given the choice of sex of an infant, what actually would they do? None of them could answer this, but they were very curious. Lederberg said, do we have any data at all on people's attitudes or choices in any range of our society which would enable us to write the econometric model of the future development of such societies, given choice in sex? Lederberg said, this is really urgent business. And in fact, in the discussion they looked to China, but to Japan in particular, in which what they call voluntary abortion and sterilization programs were underway. And that's where they looked to get some inkling of what people were doing with respect to choices around sex. They also imagined together a new kind of sexless reproduction. It may be sometime in the future biological science will solve the problem of breeding XX female-producing males. But the only procedure at present, they said, even remotely in sight, is the in vitro separation of X and Y spermatozoa combined with artificial insemination. So in 1963, everything at the end of the day about reproduction would finally come back to the world population problem that absolutely governed their conversation. Lederberg again talked about this as the catastrophic leap in world population through the uncompensated control of early mortality. We must try to anticipate the worst anomalies of biological power, as Lederberg said. Huxley always sought what he called a global evolutionary policy that would serve as a kind of stable point around which national economic policies would be calibrated. Indeed, one of the points raised by the symposium then, as ours today, was the need to think demographically about assisted reproductive technologies. They didn't really know, but they talked at that point perhaps about 5 million births worldwide. Muller said demographically, on the one hand, that's not very significant, but then immediately he said 5 million births, 5 million is a number that some nations have as a population in any given time. So our question today was already their question then. So bioscapes in 1963 were very clearly on the cusp of change. Seemingly this was a moment of optimistic high modernity that just prefigured 1970s commercial collapse, oil crises, neoliberal conflations with commercialized biology. But this was not the immediate future that they forecast at all. So many at that point were thinking about reproduction and population, seeing a kind of strange combination of medium-term decline, genetic erosion, Huxley put it, on one hand, and a kind of much more sudden, catastrophic crisis, population bombs, H-bombs. Man's new life tools, Huxley put at one point in the discussion, man's new life tools are double-edged. That generation seemed very clear. They seemed very clear, which is strange for high modernity, on genetic deterioration of one kind or another, usually pinned to the global lowering of infant mortality, hence the double-edged question. And yet they failed to perceive the imminent change with respect to women, or to perceive that an interior sphere, a psychology, was a key space for consideration. They failed to forecast that the desire for children on the part of women, and to some extent on the part of men, would be a cultural driver for the radical development of all of those technologies which they themselves had set in train. This generation even sometimes thought that children, newborns, might not be part of the private sphere at all, but negotiated as a kind of a contract, and often a contract between men. So recall the man who had asked Huxley to father his child. It was Crick, actually, Paul Crick, who said this particular element most boldly. Crick said at one point, I think that if we can get across to people the idea that their children are not entirely their own business, and that it is not a private matter, it would be an enormous step forward. Well, in 1963, many speculative biologists, not least Huxley, found an evolutionary future both interesting and relatively easy to bring into public sphere talk about reproduction. For all their efforts to see approximate future, they didn't or couldn't. And I think, in some ways, I think that somehow problematizing the state got in the way for that generation, and for good reason, as they all had to and did think through reproduction, and they were a generation that had to think through reproduction and totalitarianism. And in a way, considering states, I think, kind of caught them a little and catapulted them into thinking about this vast future, not an immediate future. In thinking about states, voluntariness, involuntariness, which they were all deeply concerned with and expert in, their tendency was then to scale out to the human species. And I think somewhere in between that generation's concern about a planetary species, about instant annihilation that they always talked about imminent catastrophe through population growth, and our concern about planetary species, a kind of a slower burn destruction through climate change, somewhere between them and us was this interesting 2 or 3 generations of neoliberalism on the one hand, and a completely different intrusion into bioeconomies of women's fulfillment through not having babies, and then through demanding babies, which we've just been hearing about. So for all of the futurism that governed Huxley's generation, they missed the brave new world of bioeconomies that were just around the corner. The difference between this 1960s discussion, which was state-of-the-art for its moment, and the imminent commercialization of a new bioeconomy now is a really astonishing distinction. And most obviously, but perhaps most critically, they forgot in 1963 to think really seriously about women. It was Betty Friedan with her psychology and perhaps her Marxism, not Huxley, the leftist scientific dreamer of germinal choice, who best caught the wave